The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty settlement of Cedar Ridge as Sarah Mitchell hung wet clothes on the line behind her small cabin. At 22, she had already lived through more hardship than most women twice her age. Her husband Thomas had been killed in an Apache raid 6 months earlier, leaving her alone to tend their small farm on the edge of the Texas frontier. Sarah wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand and glanced toward the horizon where heat waves danced in the distance. The silence of the prairie always made her nervous. In this land, silence often meant danger was approaching. She was reaching for another wet shirt when she heard it, the thundering of hooves growing louder by the second. Her heart began to race as she recognized the sound. Raiders were coming, and they were coming fast. Sarah dropped the wet clothes and ran toward her cabin, her bare feet kicking up small clouds of dust. She needed to reach the rifle that hung above the fireplace. Thomas had taught her to shoot, and she had become quite skilled with the weapon during the lonely months since his death. But she was too slow. Before she could reach the door, painted warriors on horseback surrounded her small homestead. Their war cries filled the air as they circled like wolves around prey. Sarah counted at least 12 Comanche braves, their faces painted for battle, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun. She stopped in her tracks, knowing that running would only make things worse. Her hands trembled as she slowly raised them above her head, trying to show that she meant no harm. The warriors continued their circle, their horses snorting and stamping impatiently. One of the Comanche, a tall man with gray streaks in his long black hair, raised his hand, and the circling stopped. He dismounted and walked toward Sarah, his dark eyes studying her carefully. He spoke in his native tongue to the other warriors, and several of them laughed in response. Sarah's knowledge of the Comanche language was limited, but she understood enough to know they were discussing what to do with her. Some seemed to want to kill her immediately, while others appeared to have different plans. The gray-haired leader, who seemed to be their chief, continued to study her with calculating eyes. The chief walked around Sarah like a buyer examining livestock at market. He lifted a strand of her blonde hair and let it fall through his fingers. He examined her hands, noting the calluses from hard work. He seemed to be evaluating her strength and usefulness. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the chief made his decision. He barked orders to his warriors, and several of them dismounted. Sarah was roughly grabbed by 2 young braves who began binding her hands behind her back with strips of leather. As they worked, Sarah caught sight of movement in the distance. A lone rider was approaching from the north, traveling at a steady pace. The Comanche had seen him too, and there was tension in their voices as they discussed this new development. The rider drew closer, and Sarah could see that he was also Comanche, but younger than the others. He rode with the confidence of someone who belonged, yet there was something different about him. When he finally reached the group, the other warriors parted to let him through. The young man dismounted and approached the chief. They spoke in low, urgent tones, occasionally glancing in Sarah's direction. The young warrior appeared to be questioning the chief's decision, his voice growing more insistent with each exchange. Sarah studied the newcomer carefully. He was tall and lean, probably in his mid-20s, with intelligent dark eyes and strong features. Unlike the others, his face was not painted for war, and his clothing, while clearly Comanche, seemed cleaner and better maintained. There was an air of authority about him that suggested he held an important position within the tribe. The discussion between the chief and the young warrior grew more heated. Other members of the raiding party began to take sides, some supporting their chief while others seemed to agree with the young man. Sarah realized that her fate was being decided in a language she could barely understand, by people whose customs were completely foreign to her. Finally, the young warrior turned and looked directly at Sarah. His gaze was penetrating but not unkind. He said something to the chief that caused the older man's face to darken with anger. The chief responded sharply, pointing at Sarah and then making a cutting gesture across his throat. Sarah's blood ran cold. She didn't need to understand the language to know that the chief had just sentenced her to death. The young warrior shook his head vigorously and stepped between Sarah and the chief. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The standoff continued for several more minutes, with neither man willing to back down. Sarah could see that this was about more than just her life. There was a deeper conflict at play here. perhaps a struggle for leadership or a disagreement about tribal policy. Eventually, the chief seemed to reach a compromise. He spoke to the other warriors, and they began to mount their horses. Sarah was lifted onto the back of a horse behind one of the braves, her hands still bound tightly behind her back. As the group prepared to ride out, the young warrior mounted his own horse and positioned himself near Sarah. He caught her eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod, as if trying to reassure her. Sarah wasn't sure what to make of this gesture, but it gave her a small spark of hope in an otherwise desperate situation. The raiding party rode hard across the prairie, heading north toward the Comanche territory. Sarah's body ached from being bounced around on the horse, and the leather bindings cut into her wrists. The sun climbed higher in the sky and the heat became oppressive. They rode without stopping for water or rest. Sarah's throat became parched and her lips began to crack from the dry wind. Several times she thought she might faint from the heat and discomfort, but each time she managed to hold on. As they traveled, Sarah noticed that the young warrior continued to ride near her, occasionally glancing in her direction. She also noticed that he seemed to be having quiet conversations with some of the other braves, and she wondered if he was trying to build support for whatever plan he had in mind. The landscape gradually changed as they rode deeper into Comanche territory. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and cedar trees. Sarah had never been this far from civilization, and she realized that even if she managed to escape, she would have no idea how to find her way home. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red and orange, the raiding party finally stopped to make camp. Sarah was pulled down from the horse and tied to a large oak tree at the edge of the camp. Her legs were numb from the long ride, and she collapsed to her knees as soon as her feet touched the ground. The warriors made their camp efficiently, starting a fire and preparing food. The smell of roasting meat made Sarah's stomach growl with hunger, but no one offered her anything to eat or drink. She watched as the men settled in for the night, knowing that tomorrow would likely bring her closer to whatever fate awaited her in the Comanche village. The night passed slowly for Sarah, tied to the oak tree with no protection from the cold wind that swept across the plains. She dozed fitfully, waking every time an owl hooted or a coyote howled in the distance. The Comanche warriors took turns standing guard, but none of them paid her any attention except to make sure her bonds remained secure. As dawn broke over the camp, Sarah was startled awake by the sound of approaching horses. A new group of Comanche warriors rode into camp, led by a man who commanded immediate respect from all present. Even the gray-haired chief who had captured her rose quickly to greet this newcomer with obvious deference. The new arrival was an imposing figure, probably in his 50s, with broad shoulders and scars that spoke of many battles. His clothing was more elaborate than the others, decorated with beads and feathers that marked him as a man of high rank. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sarah watched as the gray-haired chief approached this leader and began explaining the events of the previous day. The leader's eyes frequently moved to Sarah as he listened to the report. His expression remained neutral, but Sarah could sense that important decisions were being made. The young warrior who had defended her the day before stepped forward and joined the conversation. Sarah noticed that he showed no fear when addressing the leader, suggesting that he held significant status within the tribe despite his youth. The discussion quickly became animated, with several warriors contributing their opinions. From her position tied to the tree, Sarah could only watch and try to understand what was happening. She caught a few words here and there, but the rapid pace of the conversation made it difficult to follow. What was clear was that her presence had created some kind of controversy within the group. After nearly an hour of discussion, the leader made what appeared to be a final decision. He pointed toward the north and gave orders that sent the warriors scurrying to break camp. Sarah was untied from the tree but immediately retied to prepare for another day of hard riding. As the group prepared to move out, the young warrior approached Sarah. He carried a water skin and a piece of dried meat which he offered to her without speaking. Sarah accepted both gratefully, realizing that this small act of kindness might be the only thing keeping her alive. While she ate, the young man spoke to her quietly in broken English. His accent was heavy, but his words were clear enough to understand. "You come to village," he said, glancing around to make sure the others weren't listening. "Chief Red Bear decide your fate there." "Red Bear?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the imposing leader. The young warrior nodded. "My father," he said simply. "I am Running Wolf." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. This explained the young man's confidence and authority. As the chief's son, he clearly held significant influence within the tribe. It also explained why he had been able to challenge the gray-haired chief's decision to kill her immediately. "What will happen to me?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Running Wolf was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face. "That depend on you," he said finally, "and on spirits." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Red Bear called out orders and the group began to mount their horses. Sarah was again placed behind one of the braves, but this time Running Wolf made sure she was given a blanket to protect her from the sun and wind. The second day of travel was even more grueling than the first. They rode through rocky terrain that required careful navigation, and the horses struggled up steep inclines that seemed to go on forever. Sarah's body ached in places she didn't know could hurt, and the constant bouncing motion made her feel sick to her stomach. During a brief rest stop at midday, Sarah overheard a heated discussion between Red Bear and several of his warriors. Although she couldn't understand most of the words, the tone made it clear that not everyone agreed with bringing her to the village. Some of the men seemed to think she should be killed immediately, while others appeared to support Red Bear's decision. Running Wolf stayed close to his father during these discussions, occasionally adding his own comments. Sarah noticed that when he spoke, the other warriors listened respectfully, further confirming his important position within the tribe. As they resumed their journey, the landscape began to change once again. The rocky hills gave way to a more fertile valley with a stream running through it. Trees were more plentiful here, providing welcome shade from the relentless sun. Sarah could smell wood smoke on the wind, suggesting they were getting close to their destination. Late in the afternoon, they crested a hill and Sarah got her first view of the Comanche village spread out in the valley below. It was larger than she had expected, with dozens of teepees arranged in rough circles. Smoke rose from cooking fires and she could see people moving about their daily activities. The arrival of Red Bear's party caused quite a commotion in the village. People came running from all directions to greet the returning warriors and to see what they had brought back with them. When they saw Sarah, a blonde-haired white woman tied to a horse, excited chatter broke out among the crowd. Children ran alongside the horses as the party made its way through the village, pointing at Sarah and talking rapidly among themselves. Women emerged from their teepees to get a better look, some showing curiosity while others displayed obvious hostility. Sarah tried to sit up straight and maintain her dignity, despite her desperate circumstances. The procession stopped in the center of the village, near a large teepee that was obviously the chief's dwelling. Red Bear dismounted and spoke briefly to the crowd that had gathered. His words caused a mixture of reactions. Some people nodded approvingly, while others appeared troubled by whatever he had said. Sarah was pulled down from the horse and found herself standing in the middle of a circle of Comanche men, women, and children. All eyes were on her, and she could feel the weight of their scrutiny. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion or outright hatred. She realized that these people had probably lost friends and family members to white settlers and soldiers, just as she had lost Thomas to Apache raiders. Red Bear raised his hand for silence and began to speak to the assembled crowd. His voice carried easily across the gathering, and Sarah could tell that he commanded absolute respect from his people. Whatever he was saying about her seemed to be creating controversy. As murmurs and whispers rippled through the crowd, an elderly woman pushed through the crowd and approached Red Bear. She was clearly someone of importance. As the other villagers stepped aside to let her pass, her face was weathered by years of prairie sun and wind, and her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen much of life. The woman and Red Bear engaged in what appeared to be a spirited discussion about Sarah's fate. The old woman gestured emphatically as she spoke, occasionally pointing at Sarah. Other elders joined the conversation, creating a council-like atmosphere in the middle of the village. Sarah stood perfectly still, trying not to draw any additional attention to herself, while this debate over her life continued. She noticed that Running Wolf had positioned himself where he could see both his father and her, ready to intervene if necessary. Finally, Red Bear seemed to reach a decision. He spoke a few sharp words that silenced all discussion. The crowd began to disperse, but not before many of them cast final glances at the white woman who had been brought into their midst. Two Comanche women approached Sarah, and for a moment she thought they might be there to help her. Instead, they grabbed her arms roughly and began to drag her toward the edge of the village. Sarah looked around desperately for Running Wolf, but he was deep in conversation with his father and several other warriors. The women led Sarah to a sturdy wooden post that stood alone near a cluster of rocks. She realized with growing horror that this was probably where prisoners were held before punishment or execution. Her worst fears were confirmed when the women began tying her arms to the post, stretching them up above her head and securing them tightly with thick rawhide ropes. As the women worked, a crowd began to gather again. Sarah could see excitement in many of the faces, the kind of anticipation that comes before entertainment. She began to understand that whatever was going to happen to her was going to be a public spectacle. One of the warriors who had captured her approached, carrying a large knife. The blade gleamed in the afternoon sun, and Sarah could see her terrified reflection in the polished metal. The crowd grew larger and more boisterous, clearly expecting some kind of show. The warrior with the knife began to speak to the crowd, his voice rising and falling dramatically as if he were telling a story. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she could feel the excitement building in the audience. Several people laughed at something the warrior said, and Sarah realized they were probably discussing how she was going to die. The warrior with the knife stepped closer to Sarah, testing the blade's sharpness by running his thumb along its edge. A thin line of blood appeared, and he smiled with satisfaction. The crowd pressed closer, forming a tight circle around the wooden post where Sarah was bound. Sarah's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The rawhide ropes cut into her wrists as she instinctively tried to pull away from the approaching danger. The warrior began to speak again, his voice carrying the rhythm of ritual or ceremony. Other voices joined in, creating a chant that grew louder with each repetition. Through the crowd, Sarah caught glimpses of Running Wolf. He stood with his father near the chief's teepee, about 50 yards away from the spectacle. She could see tension in his posture and noticed that he kept glancing toward her while trying to maintain his conversation with Red Bear and the other tribal leaders. The warrior with the knife raised it high above his head, causing the crowd to cheer and surge forward. Sarah closed her eyes tightly, not wanting to see the blade descending toward her. She thought of Thomas, of her small cabin back in Cedar Ridge, of all the things she would never get to do. But the killing blow never came. Instead, she heard the warrior speaking in a different tone as if he were explaining something to the crowd. Sarah opened her eyes and saw that he had stepped back slightly, though the knife remained in his hand. He seemed to be describing some kind of ritual or tradition, and the crowd was listening intently. Gradually, Sarah began to understand what was happening. This wasn't going to be a simple execution. The warrior was explaining the rules of what appeared to be some kind of test or trial. The crowd's excitement took on a different quality, less bloodthirsty and more anticipatory, like spectators at a sporting event. The warrior approached Sarah again and began to tie additional ropes around her wrists, reinforcing the bonds that held her to the post. As he worked, he spoke to her in broken English, apparently wanting her to understand what was about to happen. "Knife drop test," he said, his accent making the words difficult to understand at first. "You strong enough, you live. You weak, you die." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process this information, some kind of test involving a knife drop. What could that possibly mean? The warrior continued his preparation, testing the ropes and adjusting their position on her wrists. As she watched him work, Sarah began to piece together what she was facing. The warrior positioned himself several feet away from her and held the knife up for the crowd to see. Then he made an exaggerated throwing motion, miming the act of hurling the blade toward the wooden post. The crowd cheered in anticipation, and Sarah realized with growing horror that she was about to become the target in some twisted game. The warrior was going to throw the knife at her, and she would have to find a way to avoid it while tied to the post. If she succeeded, she would live. If she failed, she would die. But how was she supposed to dodge a thrown knife while her arms were bound above her head? The warrior stepped back further, measuring his distance carefully. He began to warm up his throwing arm, making practice motions while the crowd counted along. Sarah could see that he was skilled with the blade, handling it with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. Running Wolf suddenly broke away from the group near the chief's teepee and began pushing through the crowd towards Sarah. His father called after him sharply, but Running Wolf ignored the command and continued forward. Red Bear's voice grew more insistent, but his son kept moving. The crowd noticed the disturbance and began to part as Running Wolf approached. He was speaking rapidly in Comanche, his voice urgent and commanding. The warrior with the knife paused in his preparations and looked toward Red Bear for guidance. Red Bear strode forward, his face dark with anger at his son's defiance. Father and son faced each other in front of the wooden post where Sarah was bound, their voices rising in heated argument. The crowd fell silent, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she could see the passion in both men's faces. Running Wolf was clearly pleading for something, probably for her life, while Red Bear seemed to be explaining why he could not or would not grant his son's request. The tension between them was so thick that Sarah could feel it pressing against her like a physical weight. Other tribal leaders began to gather around the two men, adding their voices to the discussion. Some seemed to support Red Bear's position, while others appeared more sympathetic to Running Wolf's argument. The debate grew more complex as more people became involved. Throughout the discussion, the warrior with the knife stood ready, waiting for orders about whether to proceed with the test. The crowd remained silent, understanding that important matters were being decided. Sarah hung from the post, her arms beginning to ache from the strain of supporting her weight. Finally, Red Bear made what appeared to be a decisive statement. He gestured toward Sarah and then toward the warrior with the knife, as if giving final instructions. Running Wolf shook his head vigorously and made one last desperate plea, but his father's expression remained unchanged. The crowd began to murmur with anticipation as Red Bear stepped back and nodded to the warrior. The knife thrower resumed his position and began to take aim at Sarah. She closed her eyes again, trying to prepare herself for whatever was about to happen. Then she heard Running Wolf's voice, speaking loudly in English so she could understand. "Move when knife come," he said urgently. "Pull up with arms. Swing body to side. Is only way." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him in confusion. How was she supposed to move with her arms tied above her head? But as she studied the ropes more carefully, she began to understand. If she could pull herself up using her arm strength, she might be able to swing her body to one side or the other, making herself a more difficult target. It wasn't much of a chance, but it was the only one she had. The warrior with the knife called out to the crowd, apparently announcing that the test was about to begin. Sarah flexed her arms, testing her strength against the ropes. She had always been strong from years of farm work, but she had never had to use her muscles quite like this before. The warrior drew back his arm and took careful aim. Sarah watched his eyes, trying to anticipate where he planned to throw the knife. The crowd held its collective breath, and even the wind seemed to stop blowing across the prairie. Time seemed to slow down as the warrior began his throwing motion. Sarah could see every muscle in his arm as he brought the knife forward. She could see the blade spinning as it left his hand, glinting in the late afternoon sun as it flew toward her. At the last possible second, Sarah pulled herself up with all her strength and swung her body to the right. The knife whistled past her left shoulder, so close that she could feel the air displacement from its passage. It struck the wooden post with a solid thunk, embedding itself in the wood exactly where her chest had been a split second before. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, clearly impressed by her athletic ability to avoid the blade. Sarah hung panting from the ropes, her arms screaming in pain from the sudden exertion. But she was alive, and that was all that mattered. The warrior approached the post and worked the knife free from the wood. He examined the blade carefully, then turned to face the crowd with a smile. He said something that made the people laugh and cheer even louder. Sarah realized with sinking heart that the test wasn't over. This had been just the first throw. The warrior stepped back again, this time positioning himself at a different angle. He held the knife up for the crowd to see, then began his preparation for the second throw. Sarah tried to estimate how many more times she would have to dodge before the test was complete, but she had no way of knowing what the rules were. Running Wolf pushed closer to the post, close enough that he could speak to Sarah without being overheard by the crowd. 3 throws, he said quietly. Traditional number. You survive all 3, you earn respect, maybe even freedom. Sarah nodded, trying to conserve her energy for the next attempt. Her arms were already tired from the first dodge, and she wondered if she would have the strength to pull herself up 2 more times. But she had no choice except to try. The warrior took aim again, this time from a position directly in front of Sarah. This would be a much more difficult throw to dodge, as she would have to move her entire body either left or right, rather than just pulling to one side. As the warrior drew back his arm, Sarah noticed something that gave her a small spark of hope. Running Wolf had moved to a position where he could see both her and the knife thrower. When the warrior began his throwing motion, Running Wolf made a subtle gesture with his hand, indicating which direction Sarah should move. Sarah didn't have time to wonder whether she could trust him. When she saw Running Wolf point to her left, she threw all her weight in that direction, pulling herself up and swinging as far as she could manage. The knife flew past her right side, missing her by inches before striking the post with another solid thunk. The crowd cheered again, but Sarah could hear a different quality in their voices now. They were beginning to respect her skill and determination. Sarah hung from the post, her arms trembling from exhaustion and the strain of supporting her full body weight. Sweat dripped down her face despite the cool evening air, and her wrists burned where the rawhide ropes had rubbed them raw during her desperate movements to avoid the flying knives. The crowd had grown larger as word of the knife test spread throughout the village. Men, women, and children pressed closer, their faces showing a mixture of excitement and respect. Sarah could hear them talking among themselves, and even though she couldn't understand their words, she could sense that her performance had impressed them. The warrior retrieved his knife from the wooden post and examined it once more. He seemed pleased with its condition and turned to address the crowd again. His voice carried the tone of someone building toward a climax, and Sarah realized that the third and final throw was approaching. Running Wolf remained positioned where he could signal to Sarah, but she noticed that his father had moved closer as well. Red Bear was watching his son carefully, and Sarah wondered if he suspected that Running Wolf was helping her cheat. If the chief realized what was happening, it could mean death for both of them. The warrior stepped back farther than he had for either of the previous throws. This told Sarah that the final test would be the most difficult one yet. The greater distance would give the knife more speed and force, making it harder to dodge and more deadly if it found its mark. As the warrior began his final preparation, Sarah tried to gather what remained of her strength. Her arms felt like they were on fire, and she wasn't sure she had enough energy left to pull herself up one more time, but she had come too far to give up now. The crowd fell silent as the warrior raised the knife high above his head, holding it there for a long moment to build tension. Sarah could see Running Wolf tense, ready to give her the crucial signal that might save her life. She fixed her eyes on him, waiting for any indication of which way to move. The warrior brought the knife back behind his head and prepared to throw with all his strength. Just as his arm began to move forward, several things happened almost simultaneously. Red Bear suddenly stepped forward and barked a sharp command at his son. Running Wolf's head snapped toward his father, breaking his concentration on Sarah and the knife thrower. In that same instant, the warrior released his blade with tremendous force, sending it spinning through the air toward Sarah. Without Running Wolf's signal, Sarah had no idea which way to move. She saw the knife coming toward her and made a desperate decision, throwing her weight to the left just as she had done for the second throw. But this time she had guessed wrong. The knife flew directly toward where she was swinging, and for a terrifying moment Sarah was certain it would strike her in the chest. She closed her eyes and waited for the impact, but instead of the blade piercing her body, she heard a different sound altogether. There was a sharp crack, like wood splitting, followed by the thud of the knife embedding itself in the post. Sarah opened her eyes in confusion, not understanding how she could still be alive. Then she looked up at her hands and gasped in amazement. The rawhide rope binding her left wrist had snapped completely. Her left arm fell free, leaving her hanging from only her right hand. The knife had cut through the rope during her swing, severing it cleanly without touching her skin. The crowd erupted in the loudest cheers yet, many people jumping up and down with excitement. Even the warrior who had been throwing the knives stood with his mouth open in amazement. What had just happened was clearly unprecedented in the history of the knife drop test. Sarah hung awkwardly from her one remaining bond, trying to understand what had occurred. She looked at the severed rope, then at the knife embedded in the post just inches from her left shoulder. The blade had cut through the thick rawhide as if it were string, freeing her arm in the process. Running Wolf pushed through the crowd toward her, his face showing relief and something that might have been admiration. But before he could reach her, his father stepped between them. Red Bear approached Sarah slowly, studying her face with intense curiosity. The chief reached up and touched the severed rope, examining it carefully. He spoke to the crowd, his voice carrying a tone of wonder. Whatever he was saying caused a ripple of excitement to pass through the assembled villagers. Red Bear then did something completely unexpected. He drew his own knife and cut through the remaining rope that bound Sarah's right arm. She collapsed to her knees as soon as she was released, her legs unable to support her after the ordeal she had endured. The chief helped Sarah to her feet, his touch surprisingly gentle for such a fierce warrior. He studied her face again, then turned to address the crowd. His words caused another wave of excited chatter among the villagers. Running Wolf finally reached them and knelt beside Sarah, offering her water from his personal supply. As she drank gratefully, he explained what had just happened. "Father say spirits cut rope," he told her quietly. "Say you have powerful medicine." "Very rare thing." Sarah looked at him in confusion. "Medicine?" "Spiritual power," Running Wolf clarified. "Spirits protect you and test. Show you have special destiny." Red Bear spoke to his son in Comanche, then turned and walked away toward his teepee. Running Wolf helped Sarah to her feet and began leading her in the same direction. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse from fear and exhaustion. "Father wants to speak with you," Running Wolf replied. "Alone. His great honor." As they walked through the village, Sarah noticed that the crowd was following at a respectful distance. Children ran alongside them, pointing and chattering excitedly. Women emerged from their teepees to get a better look at the white woman who had survived the knife drop test with apparent divine intervention. The chief's teepee was larger than any of the others, decorated with painted symbols and hung with numerous weapons and trophies. Red Bear was waiting for them at the entrance, his expression unreadable. He gestured for Sarah to enter, but held up a hand to stop Running Wolf from following. The interior of the teepee was spacious and comfortable, with buffalo robes covering the floor and various personal belongings arranged around the walls. A small fire burned in the center, providing warmth and light. Red Bear indicated that Sarah should sit on one of the robes, then took his place across the fire from her. For several minutes, the chief simply studied Sarah in silence. His dark eyes seemed to be searching for something, though Sarah had no idea what he might be looking for. Finally, he began to speak in careful English, choosing his words slowly and deliberately. "You not ordinary white woman," he said, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "Spirit speak through knife test. Show you have strong medicine." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. She didn't want to say anything that might anger him or change his apparently favorable opinion of her. "I am just a farmer's wife," she said quietly. "My husband was killed by Apache raiders 6 months ago." Red Bear nodded slowly. "Apache no friends to Comanche either. We fight them many times." This surprised Sarah. She had assumed that all Indian tribes were allied against white settlers, but apparently the situation was more complex than she had realized. "Why did you bring me here instead of killing me?" she asked, then immediately worried that the question might offend him. But Red Bear seemed to appreciate her directness. "My son asked for your life," he said. "Running Wolf say you different from other whites. He think maybe you have value to tribe." Sarah glanced toward the teepee entrance, thinking about the young warrior who had defended her repeatedly. "Your son saved my life." "Yes," Red Bear agreed. "But spirits save you in test. Spirits more powerful than my son." The chief reached into a leather pouch beside him and withdrew a small object, which he placed on the ground between them. It was a piece of the rope that had bound her wrist, the end cut cleanly by the thrown knife. "You keep this," Red Bear said. "Remind you of spirit's protection." Sarah picked up the piece of rope and examined it. The cut was indeed perfectly clean, as if it had been sliced by the sharpest blade. She tucked it into the pocket of her dress. "What happens to me now?" she asked. Red Bear was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice had a distant quality, as if he were seeing something beyond the confines of the teepee. "Winter coming soon," he said. "Tribe need all hands to prepare. You strong woman, good worker. Maybe you help tribe through cold months." Sarah realized that he was offering her a chance to live, at least temporarily. It wasn't freedom, but it was survival. "What would I have to do?" she asked. "Work with women. Help prepare food, make clothes, tend horses. Show you worth keeping alive." It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was better than death. Sarah nodded her agreement. Red Bear smiled for the first time since she had met him. It transformed his stern features completely, making him look younger and less intimidating. "Good," he said. "You learn our ways, maybe you find home here. But first, you prove yourself worthy of trust." As if summoned by some invisible signal, Running Wolf appeared at the entrance to the teepee. His father spoke to him briefly in Comanche, then turned back to Sarah. "My son, show you where you sleep. Tomorrow work begins." Sarah rose to leave, but Red Bear's voice stopped her at the entrance. "White woman," he said, using English again. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of Moonshadow moving quietly around the teepee, preparing the morning meal. The old woman had warned her the night before that Comanche women rose early to begin their daily tasks, and Sarah was determined to prove herself worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. She dressed quickly in the doeskin clothing and joined Moonshadow at the cooking fire. The grandmother handed her a wooden bowl and gestured toward a pot of what appeared to be corn mush mixed with dried berries. "Eat quickly," Moonshadow said. "Other women gather at sunrise to begin work. You must be there to show you are serious about joining tribe." As they ate, Sarah could hear the village coming to life around them. Children's voices mixed with the sounds of horses being led to water, and men preparing for hunting expeditions. It was a bustling community, and Sarah realized she would need to find her place within its complex social structure. After breakfast, Moonshadow led her to a large area near the center of the village where a group of women had gathered around several buffalo hides stretched on wooden frames. The women looked up as Sarah approached, and she could immediately sense the tension in the air. One of the women, a stern-faced woman about Sarah's age with elaborate tattoos on her arms, spoke sharply in Comanche. Even without understanding the words, Sarah could tell she was not being welcomed warmly. Moonshadow responded firmly, her voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. The conversation continued for several minutes, with other women occasionally adding their opinions. Sarah stood quietly, trying to appear respectful while the debate over her presence continued. Finally, Moonshadow turned to Sarah and explained what had been discussed. "Some women think you bring bad medicine to village," she said bluntly. "They remember raids by white soldiers, loss of husbands and sons. They not trust you?" Sarah nodded, understanding their feelings completely. She had felt the same way about all Indians after Thomas's death. "What can I do to prove I'm not their enemy?" she asked. Before Moonshadow could answer, the tattooed woman stepped forward and spoke directly to Sarah in broken English. "You work like slave," the woman said, her voice hard and challenging. "Show you worth keeping. Maybe we let you stay." The woman's name was Spotted Dove, and she clearly held significant influence among the other women. Her husband had been killed in a fight with cavalry soldiers the previous spring, leaving her to raise 3 young children alone. Her anger at white people was both understandable and deeply personal. Spotted Dove assigned Sarah the hardest and dirtiest tasks available. She spent the morning scraping dried flesh from buffalo hides with a sharp stone tool that left her hands bloody and cramped. The work was backbreaking, and the smell of the half-rotted meat was nauseating. Despite the difficulty, Sarah worked without complaint. She had learned long ago that hard work was often the only way to earn respect, and she was determined to prove her value to these women who had every reason to distrust her. By midday, several of the women had begun to notice Sarah's dedication. While they still kept their distance, she could see them watching her with something approaching curiosity, rather than outright hostility. During the brief break for the noon meal, a younger woman named Dancing Bird approached Sarah shyly. She was probably about 18, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that reminded Sarah of her younger sister back in Missouri. "You work very hard," Dancing Bird said quietly in English that was much better than Spotted Dove's. "Spotted Dove try to break your spirit, but you not give up." Sarah wiped the sweat from her face with the back of her hand. "I lost my husband too," she said simply. I understand her anger. Dancing Bird's eyes widened with surprise. She spoke rapidly to the other women in Comanche, apparently translating what Sarah had said. The news seemed to have some impact on their attitudes as several of them looked at Sarah with new interest. That afternoon, Sarah was assigned to help with the preparation of winter clothing. This work required more skill than scraping hides, and she struggled at first to master the techniques of cutting and sewing leather. But the women began to offer small bits of instruction, showing her the proper way to hold the bone needle, or how to make the stitches strong enough to withstand harsh weather. As the day progressed, Sarah noticed Running Wolf watching from a distance. He seemed pleased to see her working alongside the other women, and she thought she detected approval in his occasional nods. When evening arrived, Sarah was exhausted but satisfied with her progress. Her hands were sore and her back ached, but she had completed every task assigned to her without complaint. More importantly, she sensed that some of the women were beginning to accept her presence. Moonshadow was waiting for her at their teepee with a pot of healing salve for her battered hands. "First day always hardest," the old woman said as she applied the soothing mixture. "You did well. Spotted Dove expected you to quit before noon. What happens tomorrow?" Sarah asked. "More work, but maybe less testing. Women see you have strong heart. That important to Comanche." As they prepared their evening meal, Running Wolf appeared at the entrance to the teepee. Moonshadow invited him to join them, and he accepted gratefully. "Father asks about your day," he said to Sarah as they ate. "I told him women work you very hard, but you not complain." Sarah looked up from her food. "I want to earn my place here. I know it won't be easy." Running Wolf studied her face in the flickering firelight. "Why?" he asked. "Why you want to stay with people who were your enemies?" Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I have nothing left in the white world," she said finally. "My husband is dead, my farm is gone. Here at least I have a chance to be useful, to belong to something." Running Wolf translated her words for Moonshadow, who nodded approvingly. "Good answer," the old woman said. "Shows you understand what family means." Over the following weeks, Sarah's life in the Comanche village settled into a routine. Each day brought new challenges and learning opportunities. She gradually mastered the skills of hide preparation, meat preservation, and traditional crafts. Her hands grew calloused and strong, and her body adapted to the physical demands of the work. More importantly, she began to earn the respect of the other women. Spotted Dove remained suspicious, but even she had to admit that Sarah pulled her weight and more. Dancing Bird became something of a friend, teaching Sarah the finer points of beadwork and helping her improve her Comanche vocabulary. Sarah also began to learn horsemanship from Moonshadow, who had been one of the finest riders in the tribe during her youth. At first, Sarah was terrified of the spirited Comanche ponies, but gradually she developed confidence and skill. Running Wolf occasionally helped with these lessons, offering tips and encouragement that seemed to go beyond mere politeness. As autumn deepened into early winter, Sarah realized that she had found something in this unlikely place that she had never expected to find again: a sense of home. The work was hard and the life was uncertain, but she felt valued and needed in a way that she hadn't since Thomas's death. One evening, as she sat with Moonshadow working on winter moccasins, the old woman made an observation that surprised her. "You different woman than came to village," Moonshadow said. "Stronger, more sure of yourself." Sarah looked down at her hands, now skilled at the intricate beadwork that decorated the moccasins. "I feel different," she admitted. "More like myself than I have in months." "Good," Moonshadow said. "Spirits know what they're doing when they save you in knife test. You meant to be here." As if summoned by their conversation, Running Wolf appeared at the teepee entrance, but instead of his usual casual demeanor, he seemed tense and worried. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, immediately sensing that something was amiss. Running Wolf glanced around nervously before speaking. "Scouts report cavalry patrol approaching from south. Maybe 50 soldiers. They come looking for something." Moonshadow's expression hardened. "They come looking for her," she said, nodding toward Sarah. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had been so focused on adapting to her new life that she had almost forgotten about the world she had left behind. But of course, people would be looking for her. Her disappearance would have been reported, and the army would be obligated to search for any white captives. "What do we do?" she asked. Running Wolf was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with a difficult decision. "Father say you must choose," he said finally. "You can go back to White World if you want. Soldiers take you home, you be safe. And if I stay?" Sarah asked. "If you stay, you become Comanche for rest of life. No going back. Soldiers not stop looking, but we protect you. Hide you if necessary." Sarah looked around the warm teepee, thinking of all the people who had become important to her in the past weeks. Dancing Bird, who had become like a sister. Moonshadow, who had been more of a mother to her than her own mother had ever been. And Running Wolf, whose feelings toward her seemed to grow deeper with each passing day. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. Soldiers be here tomorrow morning, Running Wolf replied. You must choose tonight. Sarah realized that the most important decision of her life was about to be made, and she had less than 12 hours to make it. Sarah lay awake most of the night, staring up at the smoke hole in the teepee roof where stars flickered like distant campfires. Moonshadow's steady breathing told her the old woman was sleeping peacefully, but Sarah's mind raced with the impossible choice she faced. If she returned with the soldiers, she would go back to a world where she no longer belonged. Her small cabin near Cedar Ridge was probably burned or abandoned by now, her few possessions scattered or stolen. She would be alone again, a widow with no family and no real prospects for the future. But if she stayed with the Comanche, she would be choosing a life of constant danger and uncertainty. The cavalry would never stop looking for white captives, and her presence might bring harm to the people who had become her new family. As dawn approached, Sarah made her decision. She rose quietly and dressed in her finest Comanche clothing, the blue and white beaded dress that had belonged to Moonshadow's daughter. She braided her hair in the traditional style and tied it with strips of painted leather. Looking at her reflection in Moonshadow's small mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Moonshadow woke as Sarah was preparing to leave the teepee. You have decided, the old woman said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Sarah replied. I'm going to meet the soldiers. Moonshadow rose and embraced her gently. Spirits will guide you, she said. Trust your heart. Sarah walked through the village as it came to life in the early morning light. Women emerged from their teepees to begin the daily tasks. Children played games between the lodges, and men prepared their weapons for hunting. It was a scene of peaceful domesticity that would soon be shattered by the arrival of armed soldiers. She found Running Wolf near the horse corral, checking the security of the animals in case a quick escape became necessary. When he saw her approaching, his face showed both hope and resignation, as if he had already guessed what her decision would be. The soldiers will be here soon, he said quietly. Father wants all women and children moved to far side of village, away from trouble. Sarah nodded, then took a deep breath before speaking the words that would change her life forever. I want to stay, she said. This is my home now. Running Wolf's eyes widened with surprise and something that looked like joy. You sure? Once you choose this path, cannot go back. I'm sure, Sarah replied firmly, but I won't let my decision bring harm to your people. If the soldiers insist on taking me, I'll go peacefully. Running Wolf shook his head. Comanche not abandon family members. You one of us now. We protect you. Before Sarah could respond, a lookout from the village perimeter came riding in at full speed. He spoke rapidly to Running Wolf in Comanche, and Sarah could tell from their expressions that the news was urgent. Soldiers closer than we thought, Running Wolf translated. Maybe 10 minutes away. Red Bear appeared as if from nowhere, his face grim with determination. He spoke briefly with his son, then turned to Sarah. You made choice? He asked in English. I choose to stay with the tribe, Sarah replied. The chief studied her face for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. Good. Now we see if spirits still protect you. Red Bear called out orders that sent the entire village into swift but organized motion. Warriors took positions at strategic points around the perimeter, while women gathered the children and moved them to the most protected areas. It was clear that this tribe had dealt with military patrols before and knew exactly what to do. Sarah was instructed to stay with Moonshadow and the other women, but she could see the approaching dust cloud that marked the soldiers' advance. Her heart pounded as she realized that in a few minutes, she would come face to face with representatives of the world she had chosen to leave behind. The cavalry patrol rode into the village with practiced military precision. Sarah counted 47 soldiers, led by a young officer whose uniform marked him as a lieutenant. The soldiers formed a defensive circle around their leader, while he dismounted and approached Red Bear. The lieutenant was probably in his mid-20s, with the kind of clean-shaven, earnest face that reminded Sarah of her younger brother. He spoke to Red Bear in halting Comanche, then switched to English when it became clear that the chief understood that language perfectly well. I am Lieutenant Morrison of the 7th Cavalry, the officer said formally. We are searching for a white woman who was taken from her homestead 6 weeks ago. We have reason to believe she may be held in this village. Red Bear's expression remained neutral as he listened to the lieutenant's words. Many white women live on plains, he replied carefully. You describe this woman you seek? Lieutenant Morrison pulled a piece of paper from his jacket pocket. Sarah Mitchell, age 22, blonde hair, about 5 feet 5 inches tall. She was taken during a raid on her farm near Cedar Ridge. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat as she heard her own description read aloud. From her position with the other women, she could see the lieutenant clearly, but he had not yet spotted her among the group of Comanche women. Red Bear appeared to consider the lieutenant's words carefully. "No white women in this village," he said finally. "Only Comanche." The lieutenant's expression showed that he didn't believe this statement. "With your permission, Chief, I would like to look around your village. If you have nothing to hide, you won't object to a search." The tension in the air became thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah could see Running Wolf's hand moving slowly toward his weapon, and she knew that the situation was about to explode into violence unless something changed quickly. That's when she made the most important decision of her life. Sarah stepped forward from the group of women and walked slowly toward the two men. She could hear gasps of surprise from both the soldiers and the Comanche as she approached. Lieutenant Morrison's eyes widened as he took in her appearance, clearly a white woman, but dressed completely as a Comanche and moving with the confidence of someone who belonged. "Lieutenant Morrison," Sarah said clearly, "I am Sarah Mitchell." The young officer stared at her in amazement. "Mrs. Mitchell, we've been searching for you for weeks. Are you injured? Have these people harmed you?" Sarah looked around at the faces of the people who had become her family. Moonshadow watched her with proud, understanding eyes. Dancing Bird looked worried but supportive. Running Wolf's face showed a mixture of fear and admiration for her courage. "These people saved my life," Sarah said firmly. "They took me in when I had nothing, taught me their ways, and made me part of their family." "I was not captured, Lieutenant. I was rescued." Lieutenant Morrison's confusion was obvious. "I don't understand, ma'am. You were taken by force during a raid on your homestead. Witnesses saw it happen." "Yes, I was taken," Sarah agreed, "but I was not held against my will. I chose to stay here because this is where I belong now." The lieutenant looked around the village, clearly struggling to understand what he was seeing. "Mrs. Mitchell, you've obviously been through a terrible ordeal. It's not uncommon for captives to develop feelings of loyalty toward their captors, but you're safe now. We can take you home." Sarah shook her head firmly. "This is my home, Lieutenant. I'm not a captive and I don't wish to be rescued." The young officer was clearly out of his depth. He had come prepared to fight for the release of a kidnapped woman, not to deal with someone who claimed to want to stay with her supposed captors. "Ma'am, I have orders to bring back any white captives we find," he said uncertainly. "I can't just leave you here." Red Bear stepped forward and placed a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder. "She free to go or stay," he said to the lieutenant. "You see, she not prisoner. She choose Comanche life." For several tense minutes, the two sides faced each other in an uneasy standoff. The soldiers were clearly uncomfortable with the situation, having expected either to rescue a grateful captive or to fight for her release. Instead, they found themselves confronting a woman who insisted she didn't want to be saved. Finally, Lieutenant Morrison made his decision. "Mrs. Mitchell, I can't force you to return with us if you truly don't want to come. But I must ask you one more time, are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" Sarah looked around at the faces of her chosen family one last time. Then she turned back to the lieutenant with absolute certainty in her voice. "I am certain, Lieutenant. My name is Sarah Mitchell, but I am Comanche now. This is my home, these are my people, and this is where I choose to spend the rest of my life." The lieutenant nodded reluctantly and remounted his horse. "Very well, ma'am. The choice is yours to make." As the cavalry patrol rode away, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The threat of forced return to her old life was over, and she was free to embrace the new life she had chosen. Running Wolf approached her as the dust from the departing soldiers settled. "You very brave," he said quietly. "Not many people have courage to choose new life over old one." Sarah smiled, feeling more at peace than she had in months. "The spirit showed me the way," she said, touching the piece of rope she still carried in her pocket. "They cut my bonds in more ways than one." As the village returned to its normal routine, Sarah realized that her transformation was complete. She was no longer Sarah Mitchell, the lonely widow from Cedar Ridge. She was now Sarah of the Comanche, a woman who had found her true home among people who had once been strangers. The lieutenant nodded reluctantly and remounted his horse. Very well, ma'am. The choice is yours to make. As the cavalry patrol rode away, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The threat of forced return to her old life was over, and she was free to embrace the new life she had chosen. Running Wolf approached her as the dust from the departing soldiers settled. "You very brave," he said quietly. "Not many people have courage to choose new life over old one." Sarah smiled, feeling more at peace than she had in months. "The spirit showed me the way," she said, touching the piece of rope she still carried in her pocket. "They cut my bonds in more ways than one." As the village returned to its normal routine, Sarah realized that her transformation was complete. She was no longer Sarah Mitchell, the lonely widow from Cedar Ridge. She was now Sarah of the Comanche, a woman who had found her true home among people who had once been strangers. The knife drop test had been the beginning of her journey, but choosing to stay when she could have left was its true completion. She had found not just survival among the Comanche, but belonging, purpose, and the promise of a future filled with the kind of community and family she had always dreamed of having. That evening, as she sat with Moonshadow and Running Wolf around their cooking fire, Sarah reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything in her old life, but in losing it, she had found something far more valuable, a place where she truly belonged, and people who valued her not for what she had been, but for who she had chosen to become.